There is a small brass object, no larger than a matchbox, that tells the story of the Vietnam War more honestly than almost any official document the era produced. It fits in a closed fist, it weighs less than 2 ounces, and on tens of thousands of them, American soldiers scratched, stamped, and engraved the things they could not say out loud, to their officers, to the folks back home, sometimes even to themselves. The Zippo lighter went to Vietnam as a way to light a cigarette. It came home as a confession. To understand why, you have to start with the object itself, because the Zippo was almost perfectly designed for a war like this one. It was not issued. That distinction matters, and it is the first thing most people get wrong. The United States military did not hand these lighters out as standard equipment, and it certainly did not, as some later stories claim, order men never to use them. Soldiers bought their own, usually at the PX, the post exchange, the on-base store, for a price low enough that nearly anyone could afford one. What they got for that small sum was a tool that worked when almost nothing else did. The genius of the Zippo was its windproof design. The flame sat inside a chimney of pierced metal, sheltered from the wind, and that single feature made it worth more than gold in the field. Vietnam was not the dry, clean war of the recruiting posters. It was monsoon rain and river crossings and a humidity that rotted boots off men's feet. Matches turned to pulp. Cheaper lighters flooded and failed. The Zippo, refillable with fluid, its flint and wick replaceable, its heavy brass case able to survive being dropped in mud and fished back out, simply kept working. The company backed every one with a lifetime guarantee. It works or we fix it free, and in a place where reliability could be the difference between comfort and misery. That reputation was earned honestly. So the practical value explains why a soldier carried one. It does not explain the engraving. It does not explain why a 19-year-old, 10,000 miles from home, would take that lighter to a shop and pay to have words carved into it that he knew he would carry into combat. The engraving was a Vietnam phenomenon, and it grew out of a simple accident of geography. Around the American bases, in Saigon, in Da Nang, in Chu Lai, and the towns that sprang up wherever the war planted a garrison, Vietnamese engravers set up shop. For a small fee, a man could hand over his plain steel lighter and get it back transformed. His name, his unit, the dates of his tour, the place he was stationed, Ca San, Pleiku, Da Nang, a record, in metal, that he had been here, in this specific hell, in this specific year. For men who suspected the country might one day prefer to forget the whole thing, that record was not a small thing to own. But the dates and the unit numbers were only the beginning. What made the Vietnam Zippo into something historians now study was what men chose to put on them beyond the facts. Because once you are already paying to have metal engraved, you can have it say anything. And what these young men chose to say, over and over, across thousands of surviving examples, was startling. It was funny in the blackest possible way. It was bitter. It was profane. It was above all honest in a manner that almost nothing else from that war was allowed to be. A soldier could not tell a war correspondent what he really thought of the strategy. He could not write his mother the truth about what a patrol felt like without terrifying her. He could not stand up in front of his sergeant and announce that the whole enterprise seemed unwinnable and absurd. But he could hand a lighter to an engraver and, for pocket change, have it declare exactly that, and then he could carry the declaration in his pocket, produce it every time he lit a cigarette, and let it speak for him without a word. That is the thing to hold on to as this story goes on. The Zippo became a place to keep the parts of yourself that the war had no room for. It was a diary that fit in a pocket, a tombstone a man carved for himself while he was still alive, a small private act of free speech in an institution built on obeying. And unlike a letter which could be censored, or a conversation which could be reported, the words on a Zippo belonged entirely to the man who paid for them. The messages ranged from the sentimental to the savage. Some carried a girlfriend's name inside a heart. Some carried peace symbols, or the outline of a cannabis leaf, or a Playboy bunny, or a cartoon character rendered in careful lines by an engraver who spoke no English and had no idea what he was etching. And some carried sentences so bleak, so resigned to death, that reading them today is like hearing a voice come up out of the ground. Because that is finally what these lighters are. Most of the men who commissioned them were teenagers. Many did not come home. The lighter often outlived its owner, passing to a family, a footlocker, a collector, a museum case, and the words on it kept speaking long after the hand that chose them was gone. To understand what an American soldier in Vietnam actually felt, you can read the general's memoirs and the Genfiv reports and the newspaper archives, or you can read what a frightened, funny, furious kid decided to say on the one surface that was entirely his own. In the next part, we read the words themselves, and they are darker and sharper than you expect. So let us read them, not paraphrased, not cleaned up for a family audience, but as close to what was actually carved into the brass as the surviving lighters allow. Because the words are the whole point, and softening them would be its own kind of lie. Start with the one that collectors and historians return to again and again, because it captures the entire psychology of the thing in a single sentence. A soldier took the 23rd Psalm, the most comforting words in the English language, the ones read at every funeral. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, and he finished it his own way. On his lighter it read, Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for I am the evilest son of a bitch in the valley. Sit with that for a moment, because there is a whole survival strategy compressed inside it. It takes scripture, the thing a frightened boy might cling to, and it flips the fear into bravado. It says, I am not the prey here, I am the thing to be afraid of. It is a joke, and it is armor, and it is a 19-year-old talking himself into being able to walk out the wire tomorrow. That is what these engravings do. They are not poetry, they are psychological equipment. Then there is the one that reads like an epitaph the man wrote for himself in advance. When I die, I'll go to heaven, because I've spent my time in hell. No self-pity in it, just an accounting, a grim little ledger. I have already served my sentence. Whatever comes next owes me. Men carried that in their pockets and lit their cigarettes off it, day after day, in the place they had decided was hell. And then the one that is not about death at all, but about the war itself. The closest thing the enlisted man had to a formal complaint, and one of the most quoted lines to come out of Vietnam. We the unwilling, led by the unqualified, doing the unnecessary for the ungrateful. Read that as what it is. That is a soldier's entire critique of the war, its draft, its leadership, its purpose, and its reception back home, engraved on the side of a lighter because there was no other channel that would carry it. He could not say it in a briefing. He could not say it in a letter that might be read by the wrong eyes. So he said it in brass, and he said it every single day, silently, just by reaching for a smoke. There is a category of these that is pure gallows humor, the kind of thing that only makes sense to people close enough to death to find it funny. Death is my business, and business has been good. A line a hired killer might say in a film, engraved by a boy who had been handed a rifle and a body count and told this was his job now. Or the one that measures the whole experience against home and finds home winning by an infinite margin. If I had a farm in Vietnam and a home in hell, I'd sell my farm and go home, meaning, this place is worse than hell. I would rather be damned than stay here. It is funny until you remember he meant it. Not all of them were jokes, and this is where the story turns, because some of the engravings pointed straight at the darkest thing the Zippo came to be associated with. There is a well-known one that reads, in effect, let me win your heart and mind, or I'll burn your damn hut down. To understand why that line is so loaded, you have to know what hearts and minds meant. It was the official American phrase for the strategy of winning over the Vietnamese population, of proving that the United States was there to help. And the soldier who engraved that line was mocking it, bitterly, knowingly, because he had seen the gap between the slogan and the reality. He had seen, or done, the other thing. The burning. That is not a comfortable place to take this story, but it is where the honest version has to go, because the Zippo has a second life that runs directly alongside the first. The same little lighter that held a man's private confession was also, sometimes, the literal instrument used to set fire to Vietnamese villages. When American units burned the thatched homes, the hooches of villages suspected of harboring the enemy, the flame that lit the straw was sometimes struck from exactly the kind of Zippo we have been describing. The operations became known, grimly, as Zippo raids. The lighter that recorded one man's inner life became the symbol of another family's destruction. It is the same object. That is the terrible doubleness at the center of this whole story. We will come back to the burning, because it deserves its own careful telling. But hold both truths at once for now, because that doubleness is exactly why the Vietnam Zippo is such an unsettling artifact. On one face, a boy engraves his fear and his fatalism and his hope. On the reverse, in some hands, the same tool becomes fire. The Zippo did not choose. It only did what it was made to do, which was light, a cigarette, a signal, a home. The sheer range of the engravings is what makes them so valuable as a record. Set them side by side, and you are not looking at one soldier's opinion. You are looking at a chorus. The lovesick ones with a girl's name in a heart. The stoned, defiant ones with a peace sign and a cannabis leaf, carved by men who were done believing in the mission. The proud unit crests, the savage jokes, the quiet, terrified epitaphs. No survey, no poll, no official history captured the enlisted man's mind the way this accidental archive of engraved lighters did. Precisely because no one designed it as a record. It happened one lighter at a time, one bored or frightened or furious kid at a time, each paying a few coins to a Vietnamese engraver to make permanent a thought he could not otherwise let out. In the next part, we follow that darker thread all the way, the Zippo raids, the village of Cam Nay, and the day a television reporter turned a soldier's lighter into one of the most important images of the entire war. On the 5th of August, 1965, Americans sat down to watch the evening news and saw something that changed how the country understood its own war. The report came from a young CBS correspondent named Morley Safer, and it was filmed in a cluster of hamlets called Cam Nay in the countryside south of Da Nang. What the cameras captured that day would become one of the most consequential pieces of war journalism ever broadcast, and at the center of it was the small brass lighter we have been following. The setup was this. A unit of United States Marines had been sent into Cam Nay to clear it, on the understanding that the village was fortified and sheltering the Viet Cong. What the television audience saw, however, was not a firefight. It was Marines moving through a village of thatched roof homes and setting them alight, and in the footage, a Marine is seen putting the flame of a cigarette lighter to the dry straw of a roof. The homes went up. Safer reported, in a calm and devastating voice, that the operation had leveled the hamlet, and he did not hide his own unease at what he had witnessed. Old people and women and children stood by as their houses burned. The broadcast detonated. For many Americans, it was the first time the war had been shown to them not as a clean matter of strategy and body counts, but as the burning of a poor family's home by a young man with a lighter. The reaction reached the highest levels of the government, and the anger directed at Safer and at CBS was enormous, but the images could not be unseen. Cam Nay became a turning point, one of the early moments when the distance between the official story of the war and the visible reality of it cracked open on national television. A point of accuracy matters here, because the honest version of this story does not need exaggeration to land. At Cam Nay, the homes were not set ablaze by Zippos alone. Accounts describe matches and flamethrowers in use as well as cigarette lighters, but it was the image of the lighter to the thatch, the ordinary, personal, pocket-sized tool of every soldier turned to the burning of a village, that seared itself into memory. And it was from this association that a piece of grim slang entered the language of the war. The Zippo raid, the Zippo mission. The act of burning a village came to be named after the lighter, because the lighter was so often the thing that lit it. Understand what that did to the object. The very same Zippo that a soldier engraved with his fear, his love, his black humor, his private confession, the intimate personal artifact we spent the last 2 parts reading, was now also the public symbol of the war's ugliest face. The doubleness became total. Held one way, the Zippo was a boy's diary. Held another, it was fire brought to a family's roof. The lighter itself was innocent of the distinction. It was people who decided which use to put it to. But no other object of the war carried that contradiction so nakedly, and that is a large part of why the Vietnam Zippo unsettles people to this day. The association went further than the handheld lighter. Out in the Mekong Delta, where much of the fighting happened not on land, but along the rivers, the United States operated a fleet of armored boats, the Brown Water Navy, the Mobile Riverine Force. Some of these boats were fitted with flamethrowers, weapons that threw fire across the water at the riverbanks and the villages that lined them. The crews gave those flame-throwing boats a nickname that will now sound grimly familiar. They called them Zippos. The lighter had become so synonymous with fire brought to Vietnam that even a boat that spat flame took its name. So we have, in one small brass object, an almost impossibly complete symbol of the war. It is the thing a lonely 19-year-old carried to feel a little less alone. It is the surface on which a generation of enlisted men wrote the truths the war would not let them speak. And it is the instrument, and then the very name, of the burning that turned American opinion against the whole enterprise. You could tell the entire arc of Vietnam, the idealism, the disillusion, the brutality, the reckoning, through the biography of the Zippo lighter alone. It is worth pausing on why the burning happened at all, not to excuse it, but to understand it, because the engraved lighters themselves point at the answer. Remember the hearts and minds line, the mocking one, the soldier who engraved the promise to win a village's heart or burn its hut down. That bitterness came from a real and impossible situation. Soldiers were sent to protect a population and to destroy an enemy who moved invisibly among that same population. A village could be friendly by day and hostile by night. The strategy asked young men to make impossible distinctions, and when they could not, the frustration sometimes came out as fire. The engravings are, among other things, a record of men who could see the contradiction they were trapped inside, and who wrote their disillusion on the very tool that had come to symbolize it. This is the point where a lesser telling of the Zippo story would look away, keep only the charming part, the clever engravings, the collectible brass, and quietly drop the burning, but you cannot separate them. The men who wrote those dark, funny, furious lines were writing them because of what they were seeing and doing. The gallows humor and the Zippo raids grew from the same soil. The lighter recorded the war's conscience and served the war's cruelty, often in the same unit, sometimes in the same pocket. To honor the honesty the soldiers carved into these lighters, we have to be as honest as they were. In the final part, we follow the Zippo home, what happened to these lighters after the war, why they became some of the most sought-after and most faked collectibles in the world, and what it means that a frightened boy's private confession now sits behind glass in a museum, still speaking, decades after the hand that carved it went silent. The war ended, and the lighters came home, or many of them did, in the pockets and footlockers of men who survived, and in the personal effects of men who did not. And here the Zippo began its strangest chapter, because the object that had been worth a few coins at a PX slowly became something people would pay serious money to own. The Vietnam Zippo turned into one of the most collected, most studied, and most forged military artifacts in the world. To understand why, it helps to know that the Zippo company itself had a long relationship with the American military that predated Vietnam entirely. The Zippo Manufacturing Company was founded in 1932 by George Blaisdell in Bradford, Pennsylvania, and during the Second World War it turned its entire output over to the armed forces, famously producing steel-cased lighters with a black finish because brass was needed for the war effort. That was where the bond between the American soldier and the Zippo was forged. Korea continued it, but Vietnam was where the object became personal on a mass scale, where the plain military lighter became a canvas, and that is what makes the Vietnam examples the ones collectors chase. The value, though, was never really about the brass. It was about the words. A blank Zippo from the 1960s is just an old lighter. A Zippo engraved with a unit, a date, a place, and one of those savage or sorrowful lines is a primary historical document, a first-person voice from inside the war, unmediated by any officer or editor or historian. That is what people are buying, not metal, testimony. And because testimony is precious and metal is cheap, the market did exactly what markets do with anything precious and forgeable. It flooded with fakes. This is the part that trips up even serious collectors, and it is worth understanding because it says something about the whole story. For decades, workshops, many of them in Vietnam itself, catering to tourists and dealers, have produced reproduction Vietnam Zippos, engraved with the famous sayings and artificially aged to look like they spent a tour in a soldier's pocket. They pit the brass, they wear the edges, they carve the lines that everyone recognizes because everyone has seen them reproduced 1,000 times. The result is that the market is thick with lighters that carry all the right words and none of the real history. Proving that a given Vietnam Zippo actually went to Vietnam, actually rode in the pocket of an actual soldier, is notoriously difficult. The very fame of the engravings is what made them so easy to counterfeit. There is something almost poetic in that difficulty, if you sit with it. The thing that made these lighters authentic, that a real, frightened, specific young man paid a real engraver to make his real thoughts permanent, is precisely the thing that cannot be faked back into existence, no matter how perfectly you copy the words. You can reproduce the sentence. You cannot reproduce the man who meant it. The forgeries have the language and lack the life, which is, when you think about it, the exact opposite of what the originals were. Lighters that had the life first, and only borrowed the language to hold it. The genuine ones found a keeper. A collector named Bradford Edwards spent years gathering authentic Vietnam Zippos, and out of that collection came a book, Vietnam Zippos, American Soldiers' Engravings and Stories, 1965 to 1973, published by the University of Chicago Press. It photographed the lighters and preserved the engravings, and in doing so it did something the United States government had, for a long time, been reluctant to do. It treated the enlisted man's unfiltered voice as a thing worth keeping. It took the graffiti of a war and recognized it as history, because that is what these engravings turned out to be. At the time, they were nothing official. They were a private joke, a talisman, a way to pass an hour at an engraver's stall, a small act of defiance you could hold in your hand. No one carving We the Unwilling, led by the unqualified imagined a museum. No one etching When I die I'll go to heaven, because I've spent my time in hell thought he was writing a document. They were just trying to say the unsayable on the one surface that belonged entirely to them. And that exactly is why the record is so trustworthy. It was never meant to be read by history. It was meant to be true. Think about what that gives us. The official archive of any war is a curated thing, written by the people in charge, shaped by what they wanted remembered, sanded down for the record. But the Zippo archive is the opposite. It is bottom-up, anonymous, unguarded. It is what the 19-year-olds actually thought, carved in the actual moment, with no one editing them. When those lighters sit in a case today, the words on them are still doing the one job they were made for, speaking for a man who could not speak plainly any other way. The difference is that now the man is often gone, and the lighter speaks in his place. And so we end where we began, with a small brass object that fits in a closed fist. We know now why it mattered. It was the most reliable flame in the wettest war. It was the enlisted man's diary and his self-written epitaph and his 1 square inch of free speech. It was, in the wrong moment, the fire that burned a village and the slang for the burning and even the name of the boats that threw flame across the delta. It held the war's tenderness and the war's cruelty on the same two faces, and it never once resolved the contradiction, because the men who carried it never got to resolve it either. The soldiers of Vietnam were handed a war their country would spend the next 50 years trying not to look at, but some of them, without meaning to, left a record it could not fully bury, not in the archives, not in the speeches, but in brass, in their own words, one lighter at a time. They engraved their darkest thoughts because those thoughts had nowhere else to go, and the strange grace of it is that the thoughts survived. The boys who wrote "Fear no evil, for I am the evilest son of a bitch in the valley" are mostly old men now, or gone, but the lighters still open with that particular metallic click, still throw a windproof flame, and still say exactly what a frightened, furious, funny generation needed the world to know, whether the world was ready to hear it or not.